Anyway, we're looking at, again, in terms of Devorah, we're looking at the Midah of Tiferet. And Tiferet, which is the synthesis of Chesed and Gevurah, is primarily activated by Limud HaTorah, which is called the glory of Yisrael. Torah itself is a synthesis between Chesed and Gevurah. When do you give? When do you hold back? Torah is a synthesis between body and soul, right? So Torah is connected to three. Tiferet is the apex of a triangle, which synthesizes the opposites, etc. So Tiferet basically is you bring Tiferet into the world by Talmud Torah. But then the Talmud Devorah said that in your Talmud Torah, however, there's a way that you could cause Tiferet to leave the world, and that's primarily by gaiva. That when you're miskoya over other people, when you lift yourself above other people, there's a parallel process that you cause Tiferet to remove itself from its hashpa'ot, meaning Tiferet would normally be mashpia, would bring light into certain things. You lift yourself above, you cause Tiferet to go above. And then you'll recall that the Ramak Kedarko tries to be very, very specific. He identified three types of gaiva that a Torah scholar might have. One is gaiva kalape his talmidim, in which he doesn't want to spend the time explaining to them. He doesn't want to answer their questions. He's abusive to them, or at least not respectful to them, etc. I must have told you, again, forgive me if I repeat it. I told you, anyone remember the Rav Aaron Cutler story in Miami? I'll mention it very quickly. Again, I apologize. But Rav Aaron Cutler once made a statement, I won't repeat the whole story, that every teacher of Torah is potentially a murderer. Not by a knife or a gun, but by breaking a spirit. That if we speak to Talmidim without really being machshav them, and we put them down, we might kill them in a way. And that's why Rosh Hashivas have to go into exile, because if you kill somebody for shogeg, you have to go to the Yer Miklat. That's called exile. Right? So the Ramak, so that's Gaiva number one. Gaiva number one is Kalape HaTalmidim. And the Ramak says, we find in Kabbalistic imagery that Netzach and Netzach and Hod. Netzach and Hod are called Limudei Hashem. They're the Talmidim of Tiferet. So if you are maineya your light from your Talmidim, Tiferet will not shine on Netzach and Hod. And if it doesn't shine on Netzach and Hod, it's never going to get down into this world, which gets its nourishment from Malchus. That was Gaiva number one. Gaiva number two is towards Aniyim. And Aniyim here means poor people, literally, but you see from the context it includes ugly people. But basically it means people who are seemingly less significant, unimportant people. Might be janitors, cleaning crew, garbage men, whatever it would be. And that's where a person looks down at them because they're not important in, these are not my words, I'm just describing the attitude. They are not important in the world. They seem to be insignificant. So here the Ramak says, if you're misgo'eh over the lower people, so to speak, lower in quotation marks, then you're maineya Tiferet from Yesod. Yesod is described as an ani. So again, Netzach and Hod are Talmidim, Yesod is ani. Once again, if Tiferet doesn't go into Yesod, there is nothing that Yesod, which is the male organ, can deliver to Malchus. And then the final type of arrogance the Ramak identified was arrogance towards Amaratzim. I look down at people because they're ignorant. They don't know things. They're called dirt, ground. Am haaretz, people of the ground, of the earth. And here, Malchus is called earth as well, because Malchus just receives. Just like the ground receives rain, receives seeds, Malchus receives. So once again, you're gorem that Tiferet will not be mashpia on Malchus. It will not be unified. Or generally, that actually means all the six spheres, Kutchabrichu, will not unify with Malchus. Again, though, the bottom line is a relatively straightforward line. Again, the Ramak enriches it with detail, but the basic idea is that your gaiva in the world on any type of level, whether it's gaiva towards Talmidim, whether it's gaiva towards the so-called little people, or gaiva towards the ignorant, causes the light of Hashem's spheros, which are concentrated in Tiferet, to remove themselves from the world. Yeah.
Sometimes more light in down the line if they learned that people are they did their or they were around good influences or whatever it is in the moment that they built themselves up and so that they can have a greater light down the line. If they learn with people who are maybe not like the most conducive to light, then maybe fine they're being they're putting their guidance down, but they're limiting the amount of like Torah like they can accumulate over time.
No, that's very true. I think it's important to point out that the Ramak was not condemning. I mean, if Chaim Kanevsky, didn't spend most of his day, learning with first graders, that would, in other words, the issue is not the behavior per se. The issue is the attitude behind the behavior. Meaning to say, if a person feels that they need for their Torah growth to learn with people on a higher level, and that will make them better teachers, and that'll make them better mashpiyim, that's a legitimate decision. Different people have different talents, and I have to look at where my talent is. But that's not an attitude of gaiva. That's not looking down at them, meaning it's not that they're not good enough, they're not worth it for me to put my time in it. That's a very different thing. In fact, one of the most beautiful, again, there's so many stories about Rav Moshe Feinstein, Rav David Feinstein. I mean, you could spend a year just talking about stories. Maybe the center ought to have a class in. I actually bring in a lot of stories, but stories about Gedolim, official stories. But one of the stories, Rav Moshe was Rosh Yeshiva. It was not like a famous great yeshiva. It wasn't like Lakewood or Mir or Ner Yisrael even. MTJ, this was a small yeshiva in the Lower East Side. It didn't necessarily. It was famous only because Rav Moshe was the Rosh Yeshiva. But it was a very local type of yeshiva. And, they did everything. Rav David Feinstein used to change the soda machine. He would put in the Pepsis and take out the money. It was like everybody did everything. It was like a very homey type of place. But one story about Rav Moshe was especially nice. That once the people came in for night Seder, and they saw Rav Moshe was sitting in front with a 6th grade kid from the Kedemti Day, also had a yeshiva katana. And it turned out that the kid wandered into the Beis Medrash looking for some yeshiva boy to help him with his Chumash homework. And nobody was in the Beis Medrash except Rav Moshe happened to be in the Beis Medrash. So he just went over and he asked Rav Moshe if Rav Moshe could help him with his homework. And Rav Moshe sat with them for an hour, going over Chumash questions, going over Parsha questions, and the like. And somebody, felt very bad. They said, if the Rosh Yeshiva would have told us, we would have sent, a yeshiva student to learn with the kid. And Rav Moshe said, my obligation is to teach Torah to anyone who needs it. So it could be, a Rav, it could be a posek, it could be another Rosh Yeshiva, or it could be a 6th grade kid. I have an obligation to teach him too. Right, so that's what we're talking about. If you have the attitude, that's not worth it for me, that's gaiva. Okay? So the 2 points so far are relatively straightforward. Limud HaTorah brings the light of Tiferet into the world, but arrogance in the learning of Torah could drive Tiferet out. He then makes a final point in the Perek, and the final point in the Perek is that Tiferet, which is Torah, is also connected to emes, which is truth. In fact, it's all connected. Avraham is Chesed, Yitzchak is Devorah, Yaakov is Tiferet. Yaakov is also called emes, which is very interesting. Why is Yaakov called emes if so many events we know about Yaakov involve deception? I'll mention at least 3 events in Yaakov's life that seem to be either deceptive or taking advantage of someone. One is when he buys the birthright by telling Esav, I'll only give you food if you sell me the birthright. The second is Yaakov taking the brachos on Yitzchak's so-called deathbed, although Yitzchak didn't die then. But Yaakov takes the brachos by impersonating Esav. And the third example is that Again, it's Lavdavka deception, but it seems that Yaakov manipulates the way the cattle and the goats will give birth, and not the cattle, but the goats and the sheep to give birth, in order to maximize his recovery. It seems to be some element of trickery there. And yet we are told that Yaakov exemplifies the midah of emes. This is based on the pasuk in Micha that the whole Talmud Devorah began with. Kitein emes liYaakov. It is truth that belongs to Yaakov. Chesed belongs to Avram. So apparently, Yaakov was capable of using fraud, but as a necessary tool. But Yaakov's Metzias was a Metzias of emes. Whatever that means exactly, the lesson is the only people who are permitted to utilize lying are people whose spiritual essence is truthfulness. Meaning they don't lie out of habit. They don't lie out of weakness of character. They don't lie out of laziness. They don't lie out of convenience. They lie because there's a higher goal that needs to be accomplished in a certain way, but lying is essentially foreign to their metzias. Okay, they say this by many, many things. Leadership. The only person who deserves to be a Jewish leader is someone who doesn't want leadership, like Moshe Rabbeinu. If you want the job, that means you don't deserve it. You have to not want it, and then maybe Hashem will consider you worthy of that position. So be it as it may, therefore, Tiferet equals Yaakov, equals Torah, equals emes. So therefore the Ramak says, another condition to link yourself to the light of Tiferet is that you learn Torah for the sake of truth and not for the sake of achieving victory over people. Now, the truth is, this is very much connected to humility. In other words, even though these are two separate discussions, one is learn Torah with humility, and the other is learn Torah with truth. Theoretically, you could argue, well, even if I'm arrogant, I'm still learning Torah with truth. But in reality, the two are very, very much connected. Because when I'm not learning for my kavod, and I'm not learning for my glory, then I'm willing to learn from everybody. I'm not embarrassed to learn from somebody who may know less than me. I'm willing to admit my mistakes. So it is connected, meaning learning Torah for the sake of truth is very much connected to being humble, because a Baal Gaiva will always try to maximize their reputation, even at the expense of not admitting a mistake, not correcting a mistake, etc. But the Talmud Devorah says that in order to connect to Tiferet, it is not just learning, but learning with the intention of understanding the truth and being willing to admit that you're wrong. And even when there's machlokes in learning, and of course there will always be machlokes in learning, the machlokes is what is called the Shem Shamayim, to try to understand God's will. I'm not fighting because I want to state my position. We have a machlokes in order that we try to understand the truth. And that's what Chazal call a machlokes l'shem shamayim.
Does this midah apply elsewhere too, like in the same way as well, like the same mechanism?
I'm sorry, I just didn't hear you. Say again?
Sorry, does this midah apply elsewhere too in the same mechanism of like humility, or like or wanting to like just in life pursue truth, not just in the
Well, you're raising an interesting point. Objectively, it applies in all areas of life. But in this particular issue, which is linking to Tiferet is Torah, so we're describing the things that prevent your Torah from connecting to the Tiferet.
Is there like a thought to say that in other areas of life we don't necessarily have to be this like specific or frugal, like in other interactions maybe a person doesn't need to be like as honest or like.
Well, there are heterim, for example, to be dishonest in order not to hurt people and the like. But as a general rule, unless you fall under those heterim, honesty and truth-seeking is something balanced with shalom. Balanced with shalom is something that applies in all areas, not just this area. Now here, I think I mentioned before, I'll mention two quickie stories. One is Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, that in the 1930s, he was an avrech, a young kollel person, and his family was growing, so he needed a parnasa. He had to look for a job. So there was a position open in Yeshivas Kol Torah, which is in Bayit Vagan. He lived in Shari Chesed, if you know where that is. Bayit Vagan, they're not that near to each other. And he went to try out to be a Maggid Shir. And what do you do? How do you try out to be a Maggid Shir? Although I didn't go through that process here, but in a lot of yeshivas, what happens is you give a shir in front of the Rosh Yeshiva. And they can ask whatever questions they want, and they see if you know your stuff, etc. Right? So this is called a praba in Yiddish, right? The trial. So he had to give a shir. So in the middle of the shir, one of the senior Rosh Yeshivas asked him a kasha, and Rav Shlomo Zalman thought for a moment and said, "You're right, you've slugged up my shir, you've refuted my shir." And Rav Shlomo Zalman said, "I really can't go on because everything I was going to say was based on a yesod that you slugged up." And he left. He said, "Thank you, and I'm sorry to take up your time," and he left. So he figured, right, you'd figure that, I'm not going to get the job, right? I messed up. I gave a shir. The Rosh Yeshiva slugged me up. I didn't even finish the shir. So he goes home. He comes home to Shabri Chesed. He tells his Rebbetzin, I don't know exactly his words, but more or less, I messed up today. I guess I don't have the position. We'll have to look elsewhere. In the meantime, in those days, people didn't have phones. The only phone in the neighborhood was in the main post office on Rehov Yafa. You know, the old main post office. So Shari Chesed is, it's around maybe a third of a mile to a half of a mile away. It's not next door, but somebody runs in, to Rav Shlomo Zalman and said, "There's a phone call for you." That's so inconvenient. "There's a phone call for you in the main post office. You got to go take it." So he trucks over to the post office, and it was the Baruch Kunstad, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of the yeshiva then, Kol Torah. And he said, "We want to offer you a position as Maggid Shir." So he said, "How is it shaykh? I messed up. I mean, what do you mean you offer me a position?" He said, no. He says, "We know that a sharp Talmid Chacham can always finagle himself out of any question. We know we asked you a question. You could have answered it. But you knew it wasn't emes. So you didn't want to fake it out. Even though, they actually said to him, you could have faked this out. You could have gotten your way out of it. But you didn't do it because it wouldn't have been emes." That's the best type of Rosh Yeshiva we want. We want a Rosh Yeshiva who is willing to be Maida ala emes, even though he has a teretz. And that's exactly what the Ramak is saying, that I'll be Maida ala emes. Even though there might be a teretz, might be a daichik, certainly the greater the Talmid Chacham, the more they can defend themselves from all sorts of questions. But if in their heart of hearts they know it's not emes, they're going to be Maida. And since Tiferet is ultimate emes, when you attach yourself to that emes, you're zeicha to bring the light of Tiferet into the world. And as I say, although the Ramak discusses this independently of humility, but it obviously is very, very, very connected, because what makes us so invested in our pshat and in our unwillingness to be moda is a certain egotism that we have. When we don't have that egotism, we're willing to listen and be open to the other person. So anava and emes go together to a large degree. Now, I had mentioned also, again, I know I had said the story before as well, that in Novardok, Novardok was kind of an extreme school of Musar. They would always emphasize how you have to be willing to admit you're wrong. So in a typical Novardok story, they talk about two chavrusas were learning, and they had a machlokas, what the pshat in a tosfos was. And they're arguing and yelling and screaming and debating, for a real long time. Finally, one chavrusa says to the other, "Okay, I hear you. You're right." So the chavrusa says, now the chavrusa brought in the Vardik Musar. He says, No. It's not enough for you to say, "I'm right." You have to say the words, "You are wrong," meaning You have to say the words, I am wrong. Anybody could say, you're right. It's much harder, even physically, to say, I am wrong. I made a mistake. And the person said, what are you bothering me? I said, you're right. No, you have to say, I am wrong. That was the avodah. It was hard to get out those words. I am wrong. Even an apology, you think about that sometimes. If you have to ask somebody's mechila, it actually is easier to say the words, you are right, than it is to say, I was wrong. And it's very interesting, even though it's the same thing, but that's the nature of it. Right, so that's the Torah Devorah's two nekudot about three basic nekudot of Tiferet. Tiferet is brought down into the world by the koach of Torah, but Tiferet is mistalek from the world if in your Torah there is arrogance, or if in your Torah there is not a desire for emes. That causes the Tiferet to leave, and therefore you're not really connected to the midah of Tiferet. The Ramak also says a beautiful drush. What's the lashon in Pirkei Avos? Pirkei Avos says, Kol machlokes shehi l'shem shamayim. Every machlokes that is truly for the sake of heaven, sofo lehiskayim, will continue to endure. And the example the Mishnah gives is, that's supposed to be a good statement, is Hillel and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai argue over a million things. And we actually don't have that many machlokim between Hillel and Shammai as people, but the great number of machlokim we have are their yeshivos. Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, right, argue over many, 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 many things. And in 99.999%, the halacha is like Beis Hillel. So why do we bother, right? Why do we bother even learning Beit Shammai? You're learning Beit Shammai, we don't pass on like Beit Shammai. And the answer is that since both sides of the machlokas, this is what Pirkei Avos is saying, both sides of the machlokas act for the sake of heaven, then both opinions remain as part of Torah. We study them, we learn them, we analyze in depth Beit Shammai's opinion, just as we analyze in depth Beis Hillel's opinion. Because machlokas l'shem shamayim, sofo lehiskayim. Now, there is a drush, a Hasidish drush, that takes it as a negative. Interesting. But that's totally out of context. They say, when people argue and they convince themselves they're doing it for the sake of heaven, they'll never get resolved because they'll never admit that they're wrong. Each one says, I'm a tzaddik. Okay, but that's a drush, and it's a true statement, actually. But that's vaday, not the pshat of the Mishnah. The Mishnah fakert. The Mishnah uses the phrase sofo lehiskayem in a positive way. We will continue to study it. So that's Pirkei Avos, very important. The Ramak has a magnificent drush on this. He says that Chesed and Devorah are always kind of fighting with each other, right? Chesed is pulling in the direction of kindness and benevolence. Devorah is pulling in the direction of withdrawal, right? So there's a machlokes. But their machlokes is l'shem shamayim. Shamayim is a kinoi for the shechina of Malchus. They're arguing for the sake of being mashpia on Tiferet, which will give ultimately to Malchus. And therefore, that's a machlokes for the sake of the shechina. And therefore, sofo lehiskayim, both powers will endure in Tiferet, in the proper mix. This is actually a very ingenious drush. And what the Ramak therefore says is the following. If I engage with you in a machlokes l'shem shamayim, right? We engage in a machlokes l'shem shamayim. What is going to happen is we will cause Tiferet, Chesed, and Devorah to engage in their machlokes l'shem shamayim, which will ultimately be mashpia on Tiferet, which will ultimately be mashpia on Malchus. Right? So that's what the Ramak is saying, that we can mimic, so to speak, the machlokas l'shem shamayim, that is between Chesed and Devorah. Okay, so again, as I say, this second part of the Torah Devorah, we're doing a little more quickly than the first part. So Baruch Hashem, we finished Perek Zion, and then we're going to go to Perek Ches. Now, Perek Ches, the Ramak himself combines 3 spheres in one. Perek Ches takes Netzach, Hod, and Yesod all together in one Perek. So the Ramak himself is going to be Makatzer. Okay, see you tomorrow.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.